Welcome to Coffee with the Risk Manager, where we share a cup of coffee with colleagues and discuss all things risk management and higher education. It's our first in-person episode, and I'm super excited to invite Craig McAllister with University of Miami to talk with us today. And we're actually broadcasting from the URMIA annual conference. So we've both, we have our nice URMIA gift mug here that we're enjoying. And Craig, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, thanks, Stacie. I appreciate you inviting me to participate in this. I'm Craig McAllister. I'm the Executive Director of Risk Management for the University of Miami. I've been in Miami for a little over 2 years now. Prior to that, I was at Cornell University for 18 years and have been in risk management longer than I want to remember beyond that. What else do I want to say? At the University of Miami, I'm responsible for implementing an enterprise risk management program for risk financing, risk transfer, risk mitigation, claims, including workers' compensation, and just overall risk analysis and risk advice for the institution.
That's a big portfolio for a big institution.
Oh, a lot going
sizable. On. Yeah. So today we're talking about captives. And I think in particular, we're talking about captives in a hard market. Pre-hard market, I think when we evaluated captives, we think really primarily about the financial savings that they can offer. We think about how much premium we can take out of the commercial market and invest in ourselves when we're insuring our own losses. And we also think about the financial savings we can get by leveraging our captive in the market and getting better rates and better partnerships. However, in a hard market, let's be frank, we're probably not going to see as significant premium savings as we would have, say, 4 or 5 years ago. So I think we want to think about how we evaluate the efficacy of captives in offsetting some of the challenges set by the hard market, whether it's significant premium increases or reduction in coverage or even, reduction in limits, and what solutions captives can provide in that environment. And why don't you talk a little bit more about your sights on captives and kind of how you handle that?
Pre-pandemic, I didn't always see the value of a captive for higher education. And is higher ed is not for profit, the tax benefit disappears. Mm-hmm. And if there's the discipline within your financial structure to build reserves and pay claims and retentions from that reserve, that's okay. You can do that and you have the same structure that you would get from a captive. There was other benefits, such as saving premiums for first dollar policies, building up that reserve so that you can take higher retentions. But as we've seen in my 20 years in higher education, there's been at least 3 times for most institutions where all those reserves get scraped back to the middle.
That's a great point.
I mean, we've got post 9/11, we've got the 2008 financial crisis, we've got the recent pandemic, and institutions are looking for the cash. So you lose some of that discipline that's there in operating out of your accounting space.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something we're certainly faced with today as we think about the budget constraints that we're under post-pandemic. So when we think about forming a captive, right, it's really critical to think about the objective of what you're trying to accomplish here. So if it's financial savings, that should be, that if that's your primary objective, that should be your first foot forward and kind of evaluating whether a captive makes sense. But perhaps there's other objectives that are more subjective. There's more objectives that are subjective, such as your financial discipline, or perhaps it's DIC coverage or difference in coverage that can solve some of those gaps created with the retraction of coverage. Or maybe it's even just creating a tighter relationship with risk management and creating that administrative control over claims and making sure that reporting is centralized. And we're also hearing a lot of schools are evaluating pooling structures or working within each other or systems to think about centralizing some resources to better offset some of those reductions in limits.
Well, I see now that, especially with the difference in conditions, that's a big part. And with a captive being available to give one more discipline to the savings, to the retentions that you have there and the funding for those, but also would allow institutions to take part of that layer that may be there where as you're trying to build a program, the difference in conditions comes into play. So you may have some carriers not dropping down and other things, and just puts that discipline in place to fund for that. But also around sexual misconduct, TBI, where we see coverages disappearing, you need to have a savings for that and not just, worry about it 10 years down the road, because something can happen. And it just, that's where that budget uncertainty comes into play.
Yeah. So when we think about, objectives and missions of a captive outside of financial savings, who else needs to be part of that conversation, right? This is very institution specific. It's very program specific. So who else do we need to invite to the table when we're evaluating that stuff?
Well, it's higher education, so I would say everybody, okay? But really starting, I think, it's the CFO. Who's in that role, and do they understand it? If your institution has a treasurer, because of the cash flow that comes into play there. General counsel, of course, okay, or outside counsel, if that's how you're structured. But it's also your controller's office for tax purposes that come into play. And who else has an interest at the institution on this? At Miami, we have a health system. That's a big part of what we're looking at. So making sure we have buy-in from the management on that side as well is the goals that we've put together moving forward.
That's great. So in theory, right, if you bring these folks together to make the decision and collaboration, to your point, probably a committee assigned, if you bring these folks together and you outline those objectives of what you want to accomplish with your captive, you can then undergo the feasibility process. And there's limitations to what the feasibility process will identify, right? So they're going to identify the financial piece. They're going to identify, what your initial capitalization requirements are going to be, but they're not going to answer all those other questions that we just identified around, what the major objective is, what your function should be, what coverages you're putting in place. They're not necessarily going to be able to answer those.
And that's, we've talked to the objective components, right? And the feasibility study provides that. I think probably the only subjective component on that is where to domicile it, right? Do people want to ski or do they want to surf? So picking the domicile that goes with that. But also it's those other subjective concerns on this. If it's really trying to instill discipline into the institution around savings for future insurance claims, future insurance premiums, and everything that goes with that. So other subjective concerns are claims management and control of claims, being able to pick your retentions at a much better spot. Sometimes it's objective to reach out to the reinsurance and excess markets, but many times that can be strategic and gives you that more control on who you're working with is a subjective component.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and kind of sharing your thoughts on captives. I think as an industry, we're definitely on the forefront of considering this in this moment, and it's helpful to have multiple perspectives as we consider it. So thanks so much.
Great being here.
Cheers from a distance.
Cheers, socially distanced.